Hello, welcome to another edition of the Pace Report. I'm Brian, Pace reporting live here at the Iridium Jazz Club here in New York City. Tonight, blessing the stage here at the Iridium Jazz Club is pianist David Benoit. And as you might know, he has a brand new CD on the Concord label called Conversation. And what he's doing is he's meshing two of his favorite genres of the classical vein with the classical trio as well as the jazz trio, and it's a very eclectic and very original concept recording. As well as on the album, he recorded it here in New York at the famed Steinway Hall, and he was the first jazz musician as well as musician to record a live project there. Also, we sat down earlier and talked about the new recording. We also talked about his origins in classical as well as conducting, as well as talk about the latest trend of smooth jazz. As you might know, in Jazz Times this month, there was an article written in regards to the demise of the smooth jazz radio formats, as well as venues, as well as opportunities for musicians like Mr. Benoit and others to play the music. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the sounds of Mr. David Benoit and his trio live here at the Iridium Jazz Club here in New York City. Dave, congratulations on Conversation, your latest Concord Records release. And this album is different because you are conversing with the classical trio as well as the jazz trio.
That's right. Yeah, I wanted to do something just a little bit different.
Explain the concept of this, because we know throughout your career that you've also been in the classical vein as well. But how did you forge and put these two concepts together?
Well, it was originally an idea that the On Trio, they're a classical trio that lives here in New York, and they had the idea to do something with me. And so it was a commissioned work by the Laguna Beach Arts Festival. And it was part of a larger piece called Music for Two Trios. And Conversation was the last movement where the two trios come together. One is classical, one is jazz. And the jazz trio influences the classical trio, and they decide, hey, it's okay to have a little fun and to improvise.
What were you thinking about musically when you wanted to put the compositions together, as well as you're saying this was a commissioned piece of work? Where were you musically when you were trying to put both of them together?
Well, I mean, this piece actually is a few years old now, but I was just trying to experiment a little bit. And then the rest of the record came together about a year and a half ago, and I continued on a little bit with some of the kind of chill music I was experimenting with, and some new compositions, and then I thought that the piece Conversation would fit in really nice as a way to show that other side of what I like to do.
You know, something else that we have to really bring out about this is the first time that you recorded an album at Steinway Hall.
Yeah, I just recorded the whole album just down the street.
What was that like?
Blocks over. Well, it was challenging. It was great. The first thing, of course, when we got there, the equipment didn't work. So we had to wait around until the equipment was working. And we basically did the whole thing in one day. So it was a lot of concentration, a lot of work. But we had a blast doing it. I played on a fabulous Steinway concert grand that was, I guess, that Lang Lang, the piano he likes to play when he's in New York. So it had an extra vibe to it. And yeah, we had a really good time doing it.
Last week I had the privilege and honor of spending time with Dave Grusin and Larry Rosen, GRP Records, and they're just celebrating 30 years, and you were part of that great 30-year run. And first of all, tell me how you met both of those icons, and how were they very instrumental in grooming you into that great era in the late 80s and early 90s?
Well, that's a great question. I met Dave Grusin on a record date when I was 21, and it was Lee Ritenour. It was for an album by Alphonse Mouzon, and I had already been a fan of Dave Grusin's and a huge hero. And when I met him, I was so nervous, and he was very gracious and just put me at ease right away. And then I sent him a record a few years later of mine just to, hey, check it out. Never heard from him. And then Linus and Lucy went into the #1 position on the charts, and then the phone rings, and actually I was out doing something. I came back, I checked the messages, and it was Larry Rosen himself on my answering machine saying, "Hey, this is Larry Rosen. Come to New York. Let's sign you to GRP." It was that straight ahead. So I was on a plane to New York probably the next day, and then Larry and Dave were both there, and they really felt that I was a person that could really grow with the label, and so we did Freedom at Midnight was the first album, and it did very well. And then we started working together on concepts about, well, let's do a Christmas album, let's do a Charlie Brown album, and I think they set the stage for a certain level of recording, of performing, and it was kind of a mutual, neat relationship that we've had, and I'm still friendly with Dave and Larry both. I'm hoping to see Larry when I'm going to be in Florida next time. So, yeah, I've kept in touch with both of them.
What were some of the most important records that you made on GRP? Because I mean, 30 years these guys were very instrumental of segueing analog into the digital age, as well as the compact disc.
Yeah, exactly. I think Freedom at Midnight's one of my most important albums, the debut record that came out in '86. Waiting for Spring is another very important record, the one that they weren't sure about. You're doing more of the straight ahead, but they finally put it out, and it did very, very well for them. And so I think that's another really important record. Maybe the Christmas record we did together was really nice, and then the Charlie Brown stuff we did together too did well. So yeah, very, very lucky to have had that. 18 years I was with the label, so a good chunk of their history I was with them.
In Los Angeles, and one of the interesting things I read about you is that you were not really a rock and roll guy, but one of your main influences was Frank Zappa, a great rock composer.
Yeah, I rarely mention that in interviews because it's not that it's a secret, but it's just that I had a friend of mine that was way into Frank Zappa, and she turned me on to him, and I didn't like all his music, but I liked his orchestral. Like there was an album he did called Lumpy Gravy that was part orchestral, part satire, part conversation, part rock and roll. I mean, he was a true genius and very underrepresented as a composer, but actually a very serious composer, and his main influence being Edgar Varese. He was quite an influence, especially on the odd time, real unusual kind of meter. I like that about him.
Who are some of your musical influences on the piano?
Oh, there's so many. Obviously, the clear ones are Bill Evans, Always loved the way Oscar Peterson plays, but actually Sergio Mendes is a big influence. And you mentioned Ramsey Lewis. There's a very important influence, Ramsey, and I could go on and on, but there's a few right off the bat.
You being the master and the consummate composer as well as pianist, there's been some issues now as far as there was an article written in Jazz Times about the demise of smooth jazz, and one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, you were really never catapulted into that because you always did jazz as well as you did some smooth jazz. Mm-hmm. What has been happening over the last decade with the demise of radio stations here, and also the lack of promoters promoting the music again?
Well, that's a good question. We're all dealing with that issue. I think basically smooth jazz, like every format, had its heyday. The problem was it was a radio format. It wasn't really something a musician really invented. And it just, to me, I think it got more and more bland. It kind of lost its. To me, the younger artists weren't, really focusing on the music. They were so worried about getting airplay, and it kind of hoisted by its own petard is kind of an old expression. But basically, it just sort of kind of caved in because it wasn't creative enough, and now I think the artists are starting to get back to being creative and trying new things. And even for me, I was around long before smooth jazz was. I was back in the the Dave Grusin days and Lee Ritenour and Michael Franks. We were all Chick Corea, all that. I was back in that time. So I made the same mistake a lot of people made. I hired the hot producer and tried to sound like what the radio wanted me to sound like, and I realized I wasn't being true to myself, and that's when radio sort of imploded. So after that, I decided to go back, and when you hear conversation, that's really what I love to do. I'm not playing to radio. Ironically, I had a #1 song with Feeling It for about 5 weeks, but it's still always about just playing from here.
What does jazz music mean to you?
Jazz music means that it's music for the musician. And I think that's what we have to remember, that's how it got started. So we always want to remember that it's for us, it's our music, it's music for musicians. Not to say we don't love our audiences, but I think it also means freedom, improvisation, and especially having played classical music where the composer is God. You know, everything is about the composer, and you serve the composer as a classical musician. As a jazz musician, it's about you. It's about the player. And that is like no other line of music's like that. Country, rock, whatever, it's all about what can the musician contribute, bring to the table. You know, I think that's what jazz is.
That'll do it again for another edition of the Pace Report. I'm Brian Pace reporting live here at the Iridium Jazz Club here in New York City. I'd like to personally thank the legendary David Benoit for his time, as well as the staff and management here at the Iridium. As always, please visit my website, www.thepacereport.com, for my weekly column as well as my past segments. Until next time, remember, if it's in a groove, it'll make you move. Till next time, peace.